So, well, thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. Just a little bit about myself so you know where this comes from. I am a classical solid earth geologist, geophysicist, and I live two lives. My one life is my research life, is working on deformation of the earth, which I publish primarily in. But for 15 years plus, I've been teaching a lot about global environmental change, and I run a global change program at Michigan and things like that. And so it's sort of these two lives, and I have learned to say I actually have two research directions, but I don't write much in the other one, but that probably should change at some point in time. So what I've been doing for these 15 years with a whole bunch of colleagues in the social sciences, in business, in the humanities, is to talk about aspects of global environmental change. And I thought what I'd do, given that I'm here for Earth's Future as part of my editorial role, is to reflect a bit on that component that draws it all together that we call the Anthropocene. And what I will do is a sort of I was told to keep it a little bit shorter than a normal full-size lecture, so I trimmed some stuff out. But it's essentially what I give as a presentation as an outreach type talk to a number of places, but also what I give as a summary talk to the class that we teach on the Sustainability Challenge, which is a long class on issues of sustainability. And so you look for the cutest thing you can find, you get the title, Living in the Anthropocene. The older people in the audience might recognize the picture, those damn apes. Remember the movie? Or maybe it's rotating again on cable TV. So I'm going to talk about aspects of the Anthropocene, but also going to sort of give you a bit of an idea of what's one way to look at it, what way might be actionable for people that care and looking at our future. It's important to realize that we're extremely lucky. You are so lucky you won't believe it. The planet is just right for you and for me. It's just, everything is perfect. It is just the right amount of radiation. It's the right size. And most importantly, it is just not too warm, not too cold. So we just picked this just right. So when we got here, we did something very smart. We also have to remember and realize that this is a fairly narrow window of perfection that we live in. And so I love this way of describing this as the Goldilocks planet, because it is just right. But we have to keep in mind we can make it just unright if we just tinker with things too much. And this is exactly where the role of humans, of course, is starting to take its toll a little bit, of seeing how we shift the balance and how we might want to make sure we don't shift the balance too far. But it's really important to realize that it's a pretty narrow window in which humans and a lot of other, especially mammals, live in a comfort zone on our planet. And as we tinker with the comfort zone, we have to keep in mind we're tinkering with our own future. And one of the messages I always give to everybody, I'm a geologist, that don't worry about the Earth. The Earth is going to be just fine. Worry about the humans if that's what you worry about. And it's very important to realize the window is ours, not the planet's. The planet will be there long after us and has been there long before us. That's the power of deep time, of course. So let's always keep that in mind as we tinker with the scenario. So I was a geologist, and so I take the periscope of time, of deep time. I sort of have the value of understanding how things take place. Geologists have an understanding of the rate of natural processes, which are not the same as the rate of processes that you and I are familiar with. Pretty much we live in cycles of 80 years. You know, that's how long we live. Then our grandparents and our parents. That's not nature's rate. Nature has its own pace. And looking at the geologic record, we actually can see that that pace of nature has led to very large variations and very large changes. The question is the rate of change changing? Or is it just the change itself that is changing? Meaning, is the happenings today, are they occurring at a pace that's unusual? Which the answer is pretty much yes. But there have been changes as large, if not larger, in the past. And that's why I said the Earth is not in danger. It is really human society need to think about how this goes. But we do not know what rate changes today will do for understanding how our planet evolves. And that's a key element to explore, and that's what scientists are doing, is try to understand by modeling, by types of scenarios to figure out the rate change in that scenario. So you notice there's a U there. You're sitting on this little edge there. That's the edge of your life. You know, it may not go on anymore. We might be just staring down the abyss, which of course is not true. But the point I'm trying to make is we are here now at this stage in this long history, and now we are at the stage where we better figure out what the rest of that curve of time would look like, what our life will be there. And that's the concept of the Anthropocene, which tries to figure out what does the planet look like now that humans are such major drivers in that scenario. Now there's a debate what an Anthropocene is, and I'm not going to go there, although I will write up something about that in the near future, where we draw that boundary. But it's important to realize that now the you over there, is actually driving your own environment, that we are the agents of our own environment. And that is brilliantly demonstrated by a series of analyses that were done by Will Steffen. At the time he was at ANU. He's now retired from ANU. And he simply had time on his hands, and he sort of plotted everything against time. Now, where you sit, you cannot see any of the details of these diagrams. That's not because I can't make a PowerPoint. That's the other reason. But it's not important. Because what you see is at the bottom, every plot at the bottom shows from 1750 to about 2000. And all the other things are just topics, and I'll show you even more of that. And the only point to drive home from that, whatever you see from the diagram, is that everything suddenly seems to go up. Suddenly, at some point in time, and the things that are on there are number of telephones, urban population, number of McDonald's restaurants, the GDP. Everything accelerates at some point in time, and acceleration is usually a key driver of change. And so the terminology that people have started to use, which is very attractive, is give this concept a name called the Great Acceleration. Meaning a lot of processes that are connected with human society are occurring now at a rate that hasn't done before, and at numbers that hasn't done before. This next block shows coastal zone impacts. It shows climate change, atmosphere, ozone depletion, all these topics, but all these diagrams have the same thing in common. At about, one second, here, onward, you see that it kicks in. That's the big change we're seeing today. That is where some of us would like to say that's where we should draw the Anthropocene, when the big change started to kick in. And that's why this concept of the Great Acceleration is so powerful, because there's about 35 indicators, they all show the same. We are changing things in an unprecedented manner. And sometimes tweaky things like number of cell phones, of course you can just have fewer cell phones, but it's emblematic of what society is doing, of course. It's not the exact scenario in that case. So this is that's the background of what we work with, this large change, this great acceleration, and I'll come back to that as time goes by a little bit. So what's driving this, of course, what sort of the top driver of this change that is on all these diagrams is really, of course, us, the number of us. And human population demographics is actually a very important ingredient to understand and to actually explore the role and the changes that are taking place in human demographics are remarkably large. This you all had in some form, it's all familiar. There's text on these slides that I don't usually read my slides because I can't sometimes, but also because you can read yourself. But the point is, of course, we've seen this acceleration in the number of people on our planet. We see that it has been growing rapidly since at about 1900 or something like that. You can see the diagram at the bottom. I don't think I have a mouse either. You can see around 1900 the acceleration kicks in. That's the great acceleration there. We've seen, some of you have lived through that, doubling of the population taking place in your lifetime. Predictions of when the doubling takes place again depends, of course, on the calculation of the rate. We're right now growing at about less than 1.4%, or less than 1.3% actually even today. A little quick trick, you divide 70 by 1.3 and you get the doubling rate. Divide 70 by the percentage, you get the doubling rate. Remember that for your bank account. Get 2% interest, it takes 35 years to double your bank account. No worth to wait for. But it gives you a sense that doubling rate has been taking place at an unprecedented change. But also, this is very important, we have seen already in the last couple of decades a change in this population demographic by the fact that the rate of growth is slowing down. The J curve that you were taught in school when you heard about demographics really is becoming an S curve, meaning that the tip is starting to level off. And therefore projections of 13 billion people by the middle part of this century as they were in the 1960s. Now we know that approximately the number is going to be around 9 billion people living on our planet when we are in the middle of the century. And that's simply because the rate of increase is slowing down, primarily because the birth rates are dropping. The death rates already have dropped, but the birth rates now are dropping. That is what the growth rate is all about. It's the distinction between birth rate and death rate in that scenario. So 9 billion people in the middle of the century and maybe about 10 billion people down the road. But it's like many things. Global numbers don't give you the real picture. You have to dig into these numbers. That's when the power of understanding the process takes place. This is what matters. Where does this growth occur? Where do these numbers take place? In the lower right diagram, you can see this sort of this greenish color at the bottom. That's the projection from all the way up to about 2100. That shows simply that the Western world, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, North America, won't see much change. The number of people on the whole will stay the same. All that change has been and is taking place in what we call emerging economies or less developed countries, and that's not slowing down. And so the issue really of population dynamic is not just one of global numbers, but also where these numbers are. And of course, on the map at the top, the more colored diagrams show you where these greatest increases are. You can see these are also the pressure points of a lot of issues before us today. So suddenly this number of 9 billion becomes different. It's not going to change how you and I will live in this country. We'll be still about 350 million people or something like that. But it's suddenly going to be double the number of people in some other countries around the world, which is the incredible pressure point. So that's the first point. Distribution of the population is a really key thing to understand and to consider, because that's what we have to deal with. We can pretty much be sure that our nation will stay about the same numbers, and so will actually all the other nations. Some might even shrink, like Japan is in trajectory to shrink, and Italy and places like that. So that's a major trend. This is trend number 2 in human population. So trend number 3 is also a huge change, which was never really seen before. And that is, not only is it a function of which countries people live in where we see the increases or not, is that increases occur now primarily in urban areas. Urbanization is the largest shift taking place in human demographics. Meaning that only a little while ago, you basically thought people live in the cities, live in the countryside. Now that's all gone. 60% of people already live in urban areas, and 80 or 90% of people might live in urban areas by the end of the century. Meaning, not only is there a greater population, it is very highly concentrated. Meaning the effects of large populations is something that is a very concentrated issue. So I grew up, I read about this city called New York. It was a special thing, as a kid. I'm from Holland. You saw these pictures, a lot of people live there. Yeah, New York is just one of many now, one of 20, 30 cities that will have multi-million people living there. And if you now, of course, if you have this sort of the benefit of going to other places like India, or you go to Rio, Sao Paulo, you truly get a sense of what population density is. I mean, Sao Paulo is staggering with 25 million people living in a city that's made for 8 million people. And so you see, this is the other trend. It's a high concentration. That in a way is actually interesting, because if you have issues with population dynamics and the numbers, because it's concentrated, you might actually have a solution closer at hand, because you can reach a lot of people because they're concentrated. So this urbanization is not necessarily always a negative thing. It gives us opportunities to handle issues of food, of water, of energy in different ways, because we are concentrating where the people are. We don't spread them out over an entire part of the planet. It's a huge trend, it's unrivaled, it's going faster than anybody thought, and it's just following its way forward. Urban areas get larger, but people are moving there. China, as it evolves, urbanization is going at a pace that greatly exceeds what there was before. So there are 3 major trends: numbers of people, where they are, and where they concentrate. That is really what is the driver of all these changes. So the question that we ask ourselves is this: what is it like to live in that world? Right? What is it like living in a world that really is populated by humans, populated by humans, populated by humans, people everywhere, and consuming, needing things everywhere. And it comes down to the fact, of course, ultimately, sustenance of people relies on food and on water. Today, we have a bit over 7 billion people. There's enough food on the planet to feed 7 billion people. There is no need anywhere on the planet for hunger. Most of the hunger on our planet is a political decision. It has nothing to do with the availability of amounts of food. But as your numbers increase, you of course have to keep in mind that you then have to start to worry about, do we produce enough food? There is certain amounts of food that you need to sustain yourself. It's about half of what you and I consume. But there's a certain amount of food you just need to have, otherwise you get ill. That disproportionately, of course, affects children. And demographics is driven to a large extent by the numbers of children, because that's the bottom of the demographic pyramid. And so you have to realize that as you have greater stresses on the planet with numbers of people, there are some groups disproportionately affected by those stresses because they can't handle the stresses. A kid that doesn't get water or food is much more conducive to be ill and has major diseases than an adult typically is in that scenario. So we need to use the planet. We are consuming our planet. The good term for that is ecosystem services. How much does the planet give us? What can a planet take? Is it 9 billion? Is it 12 billion? Is it 15 billion? That's the question we got to ask ourselves. We know it's going to be 9 by the middle of the century, and we probably think it can sustain that. Can it sustain 12 billion? Well, it becomes difficult. But then again, remember, we've always found solutions along the way, so don't despair. But it's an important question to ask, because you just do the calculation. You need so much food. That's what you get in that scenario. Today, as I said, hunger is on our planet, but it's a disaster that there's hunger on our planet, but it's also a disgrace that there's hunger on our planet, because it doesn't have to. We have enough food on our planet to feed everybody. But as you see, nearly 1 billion people are hungry, and many of those are children, the least privileged of our society, the voices often not very much heard. That doesn't bode well for the future when you add another 2 or 3 billion people, if already today, when we don't have a shortage of food, still there's hunger as a sort of a deeply embedded scenario. That's the food part in the scenario. Water, that's probably the most important one in many ways, for 2 reasons. Primary reason is water. All of you, I actually asked for a glass of water as I gave a lecture, because we can only do with water about 2 days. After 2 days, we start to say crazy things, and after 3 days, we start to stop talking, and it's usually over after that. Water is just the most immediate need for all humans to actually continue on. You can be without food for about 30 days if you have enough water. But water, 2 days or so. So you know that water is going to be a pressure point. And what we'll see around the world, because water is very unevenly distributed, even in the US, what we see around the world is that water, because of uneven distribution, but also the population, and again I can't point, but look at these population areas that I showed before. They're also typically areas where they're water starved. So this is a collision course. The greatest number of increase in people where there's the least availability of water, and that's not going to change. Warming of the planet will change the water, the hydro system a little bit, but not much to affect that type of scenario. So one prediction would be that water is going to be the primary driver of social unrest, or for that matter, national unrest, strife. You can imagine having 1 billion people in India and 1 billion people in China both looking for water that probably can give water for about 500 million people will usually not end well. Since most strife in the world was based on resources, water is the next sort of battleground. And even in the US, we see that. I learned in our meeting today that the water that falls in Colorado is owned by California. It's just a great world. The point being, water is going to be a huge driver in that scenario. So keep an eye on that part. It will come up in many things as you start to see that water becomes to be the entrenching thing. By the way, I come from Michigan, which is the new Gold Coast of America, because we own 1/4 of all the fresh water in the world that's readily accessible. So eventually, I always tell the students that I teach in Michigan, we have no hurricanes, no earthquakes, we have nothing, water. So we have everything. There's some places, very disproportional. It's hard to get it to other places where most people live in that scenario. So then the planet is changing, right? Not just people. You hear a lot about this, and I'll keep that very short. It is a scenario, of course, that's on the front page for a number of reasons, not always for the right reasons. But we are seeing, of course, an ongoing change taking place. All of us living in the East are not particularly probably enamored by the thought that last year was the 4th warmest year on record. It didn't feel like that. It wasn't like that for you. It wasn't like that for me, but it was globally that. And it's an important always point to drive home, of course. Your experiences of warm and cold are important, but don't measure the change that takes place. But we can see that the record is clear now. There's no debate about there is climate warming. There is no debate there is climate warming. There is no debate. It just happens to be that every now and then a voice comes up and gets a lot of attention because people like to have people that speak the opposite. But keeping that in mind, I mean, the scientists are all done with this. Climate change is not a research topic in the sense of like, may it happen, may not happen, it's happening. But it's what I call, and this is something that's a bit controversial, I call this gradual change. It gets a lot of attention, and it deserves a lot of attention, but it will play out over several decades, over quite a few decades, in fact. And that doesn't mean it's not important, but we can sort of handle the change maybe better because it is still a gradual change scenario. And we know the scenario takes place because we have the indicators, right? To just make sure that I drive the point home. We know what the indicators are. We use the ice as the canary in the coal mine The ice melting is a good example of that. We see it as a global warming, although that's ice, of course, is not distributed in the same way. We can see in all kinds of other indicators. And we even know what drives this as well. Climate change is not a debate. We know what the driver is, because the reason why you live on a Goldilocks planet, and remember this one, is because there are greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are good news. If there weren't greenhouse gases on our planet, you would not be here. We'd be a frozen ball of ice. It's too cold on our planet. So this idea that greenhouse gases are bad is not right. But adding more greenhouse gases simply will make the planet a little warmer. That's just the physics of the system. The debate on climate change doesn't exist. It's very obvious. Because we see the primary thermostat, which is CO2. That's the thermostat that we set. We turn the thermostat up, meaning we turn the CO2 up. It gets warmer. But I always say climate change is like going to a room and turning up the thermostat. It doesn't get warmer like that. It takes a little while, right? That's exactly what the CO2 thermostat does. So turning down the thermostat in a room doesn't cool it down like that easy, because there's no air conditioning in the system, all right? And so we see this climate change process revolving forward. It is there. There's no doubt about it in that scenario. The scary thing is this. Since we know that it's happening, we know what's driving it, the physical driver. So what's the human driver of that? Well, we made absolutely no plans, no change whatsoever. The single primary driver for the change that we see in climate is our demand for energy. And every Western society, every modern society needs more and more energy. And so these are projections that are done, and the projections are just what they are, but they're usually pretty much in line. It shows it ends, the purple is the orange is 2015 and onward. It simply shows the fact that we just need more and more. We may double our needs in not that long from now, maybe in about 40 years or something like that. But that energy that we are using has completely been unchanged in the last several decades. Knowing about climate change, we still use 80 to 90% of our resources are fossil fuels. And there's no indication that this is changing at all. You probably can't see the diagrams very well, but all the lines, the 3 lines at the top in the right diagram, are all the types of fossil fuels. All the nations that need more energy will get it from fossil fuels. They have not changed the infrastructure. So somebody continuously sets up the thermostat. Here's the thinking. You turn up the room, right, to make it a little warmer. You can turn the thermostat even more. The room doesn't get warmer more quickly, but eventually it will. What we're doing is not only have we turned the dial a little bit to make it a little warmer, we keep dialing it higher and higher. It doesn't feel that way all the time. It doesn't change the rate, but it will change the outcome. More than 80% will be still fossil fuels. We have made no serious plans to change that. And the emerging economies are following the exact same path, because it is true. It is easy, fossil fuels. It's a very manageable and a very sort of convenient type of resource, although sometimes you need a very large armed forces to protect it in some particular ways. So it comes down to us, our demands of how we live in this society, of how we actually are affecting the world around us, how we affect the climate that is around us. And so that comes to the questions about us. Because if you think about climate and it's so linked with energy, you simply have to ask the question, how much is enough? It's like food. How much do you really need to eat, and how much are you eating? And it's the same with energy. Our energy consumption, this is a diagram, one of my favorite websites is called gapminer.com, which is a visual way of showing data over the years, the numbers of data points. And I apologize that I can't point to things, but all these bubbles are countries. The big red bubble is China, the big bluish bubble is India, and the US is where it says, well, US. That's the yellow bubble over there. And actually, what you can sort of figure out that you can sort of see in well-developed countries, you figure out what's a good way of living. A very powerful way to start to think about what life is all about is to move away from the only one thing that we only talk about, which is money. We pretty much measure everything that we do in our world today by money. And so what some organizations are trying to do, in this case it's the UN, is try to integrate other aspects to a measure of what it is to live on our planet, not what well-being is all about. Education, healthcare, equity, all these kind of issues that you don't express in money, clean atmosphere. And so it's called the Human Development Index, which simply is a value to say, how good is life to be in some place? And this is what's powerful about this diagram, because as you'll see from the bottom to the top, on the vertical axis it goes from 0 to 1. It's a normalized curve, it doesn't matter. That it could be any number on there. But you see all these countries, of course, all of them are below, and I put 2 red lines there. The one vertical red line is sort of where the curve starts to flatten out, which means from then on it makes no difference anymore. The horizontal line is where a lot of countries are still on, which consume just more energy, but with no gain of quality of life. There's no gain to it. I mean, you could argue that it's better to live in the US than in Italy, but frankly, if you've been to Italy, you might actually want to live in Italy. Hey, I'm from Michigan, you know, we had a long winter. But the point being is that you need to ask the question, what's enough? It's just like food. How much food are you going to consume? And when do you realize that maybe you shouldn't eat more because you don't have to? Same with the energy scenario. The US is an outlier. Luckily, there's always a winner ahead of us. There are some places where they try to cool the outdoors, and we just cool the indoors. But there's some places where they actually do the craziest stuff. But we are way out there. We are just enormous consumers of energy. But we cannot argue that it's better to live here than in Sweden or in Germany or, for that matter, in the Netherlands, probably the UK, just to tease Mike. But the point being, you got to put these things in this context. You realize that we are consuming more than necessary. We are consuming as society. And in the US, we can dial that back a little bit. But all the countries aspire to be the US. That's the scariness here, right? If I would roll this as an animation, which I didn't do because I wasn't sure it was going to work, you would see all these bubbles move from the bottom, all move up to where they're sitting today. They all move in the same direction. We can predict exactly when China will use a certain amount of energy because it follows these exact same pathways. And in fact, China, of course, has followed that pathway. This is up to 2007, but it's followed that now as the larger producer of CO2. So that's the one scenario that directly interacts with us, which is the scenario of what are called gradual change. What I emphasize more when I talk about things is that there's a complementary pattern going on, and let me be bold, I think it's actually more concern than anything else, and that's what I call the abrupt change. Abrupt change is when things happen that suddenly take place. Your basement floods, that's an abrupt change. Unpleasant? Exactly. A city floods. A landslide occurs. An earthquake hits a large city. Those abrupt changes turn out to be unusually affecting modern society. And the reason is, in the past abrupt change, we didn't have much. So just got some flooding in our house. You move on, you build your house somewhere else. Our infrastructures are completely not prepared for abrupt change. We're building infrastructures in a modern world that are quickly kicked upside down. Fukushima, Japan, I mean, unbelievable. One of the wealthiest nations in the world, one of the best prepared nations in the world, and it's just sloppy stuff. And they have this nuclear disaster that takes place simply because they rely so much on infrastructure it can't take anything. By the way, that was poor management there, but it's what a lot of places are, poor management. There, the water, of course, was flooding the motors that were supposed to cool the system, and it's kind of crazy in hindsight, but it's what they do. That's the mistake they did. But these abrupt changes are the larger disruptors. And I'm not going to do what you expect, and I'm not going to do much of it anyhow. It's not about the number of people that die, which is the big thing that we often do. It is astonishing to see the economic impact of these abrupt changes. Economies are brought to their knees when there's a large abrupt change. Economies that are relying on modern infrastructure. When Japan had the earthquake in the 1990s, it changed entirely its investment policy and looked very inward. It never climbed out of the recession because it changed its policy. Now, Germany, because of the Fukushima effect, has decided not to have nuclear energy. So Germany is recarbonizing its economy. They are going back to a carbon economy because they have said no to nuclear, even though they built some other scenarios. The impact of abrupt change is enormous because people react very quickly to abrupt change. When your basement floods, you're not going to go on vacation and say, I'll be back and see what it looks like. You react. That's what we do. And these abrupt changes turn out to be a large driver for change in that scenario. And what it comes down to is that now you and I, unlike climate change, are starting to play a little bit of a Las Vegas risk game. We are actually doing a scenario. It's a busy slide. Don't worry about it. I'll talk about it. But you're making decisions that you know might immediately affect you. A storm might hit you somewhere. You are doing your own risk analysis. You may not know it, but you have an infrastructure. You are not really calculating out your risk, but you're taking a risk. It's like going to get an operation and the doctor says 70% it goes well, 30% you might have complications. Well, that's a risk analysis. Our society, the Western society, is doing that for all these abrupt changes. We simply have to figure out that there's something out there will happen, a hazard will happen. But the point being, we make a risk analysis. We know what's out there. We can tell you pretty much every event, every certainly physical event that might happen to us, and where they might happen, and what the impacts are. We can calculate out what is your vulnerability, meaning how much exposed are you to it? How much can you resist it? Right? Can you keep the water out? How much have you adjusted to these scenarios? This is the vulnerability in the equation. We're doing a risk analysis, and basically that is what is called a resilient society, meaning how much risk can you take before you actually collapse the structure that you're in. This work of calculating what the risk is on the right as a function of if you know what the issue is and what your vulnerability is by the way what all insurance companies do. That's how the bill that you get is set is based on insurance companies calculating out your vulnerability for a certain hazard. This is also why insurance companies, by the way, after large hurricanes like Andrew, figured out they can't afford it on their own. They have to pool their resources. So there's only a few large insurance companies in the world that they pool all the resources, like Munich Re and Zurich Re. And they are the consolidators because these events, they figured out the calculation, they can't afford it. They have to sort of balance their rates in that particular scenario. But so that's what you live in a society. And the resilience of our society, that's really what we have to think about. How can we handle those changes? How can we prepare, absorb, adapt, and recover for not possible, but certain events that are before us? Not everywhere, but in different places in that scenario. It's an important thing to keep in mind. We are doing a risk analysis in our own mind. If you go on vacation in California, you are assuming there's not going to be an earthquake when you get there, right? Let alone living there. But it's also important not to tell everybody how disastrous it all is. You should think about solutions. It really is all about solutions. It's all about accepting the changes that take place as we go about. So here's a number of things to take away as you think about solutions. Make more for what you need. Create more food if you have more people. That's certainly a possibility. All right? Humans have been incredibly creative. When we needed more agricultural practices, we got animals to work for us. When it wasn't enough, we built machines to do that for us. When it wasn't enough, we started to go into the genetic code of food, right? We found ways to do that. That's one way to go about it. We're incredibly creative. Never underestimate the power of human ingenuity, I always say, because it will get the way. It may not always be the best decision, but we go the way. We might actually want to consider more aggressively that maybe there are enough people now on our planet, that we want to put, to say, fewer forks on the table. We may want to realize that eventually we can't let this keep going up. There's got to be, there's a limit to what we want to see in that scenario. And issues like family planning now are much easier to discuss, but they weren't a long time in Africa where these were linked with social standing and the like. And in particular, what people recognize, the target audience, of course, is women. Getting women more equity, getting them information, giving them education, that was the primary driver of being able to actually make this human population change take place. And this is why a lot of outreach is focusing on women, of course, in countries that are especially of the emerging economies. That's the group that actually to a large extent holds the future in their hand, both because they have the families and they have the kids, that scenario. But the other thing is, of course, we're also pretty rude with each other. The last point is a bit of more of a fuzzier one, but there is something called social justice. I mean, we do need to accept that we are not alone, that just you getting something means somebody else does not get something is really the truth. We do have to teach a little bit better manners. When we have kids, we teach them good manners. And as adults, we don't. Well, you might kind of wonder, eventually the kids will tell us, where are your manners, right? Because that's really what this is about. And we like to look at governments and we like to look at other things. Frankly, you have to look at yourself. It is no sense to wait for somebody else to do anything because we are in Washington, nothing happens here. That tells you enough. It's you that has to make that decision, has to make that change. So getting better manners is probably the most important part, but it's realizing what you should be doing and where you should make decisions. And that's part of the solution in that scenario. There's probably nothing that insults you on this list here. Yet, nothing has changed, right? Really, this is the sad part. Nothing has changed. It is really, we are treating our planet. We need more and more of our planet. But I can tell you already, if you thought it was a solution, no, the planet is not getting any bigger. Okay? So that's the one constraint that we have. We are consuming a certain amount of our planet. We are reaching that threshold. The planet's not getting any bigger. And so we have to live with the fact that stresses will come up. So why don't we do anything very much? Because there's a fundamental social dynamic in place that humans do not react very well to gradual change. That simply means if something doesn't happen suddenly, if you know that the groundwater might be going up and your basement might flood, you're not going to do anything about it. If your basement floods, you immediately do something about it. Humans are wired to react to abrupt change. This is why I always emphasize the abrupt change scenario as well, because that is where we show our best. That's when we get out. Remember, we all go out, we send out troops to fix things. That's what we're good at. We do that immediately. But yet, the gradual changes are also taking place, population numbers, warming and the like. We don't react well to that. We don't basically know what to do with it. It could be tomorrow. There's sort of a postponement scenario as we go about. The other thing is that we're also just like who we are and what we do. We do not like changes in our lifestyles. I teach 18-year-olds, and I would say the worst news I have for you is that you will be like your parents in 30 years. And I always tell them, when I was young, I said, I will never be like my parents. No, of course, I never became like my parents. No, I'm like my parents. And so the point is we don't make changes. We don't like also lifestyle changes. We're willing to tweak, but we're not willing to make radical change. There's nothing wrong with it. That's the way we are, by the way. That's how we wired in that scenario. Therefore, we don't make large changes either. We look at governments to make change. We don't want government to make change either. So the government role doesn't really work very well either because we really don't want them to make change. We just pretend that we want to have some leadership, but really that's not the way we wired. We are just gradualists in many ways in that scenario. So you have to put the mix in there, right? So you have to realize that maybe humans should use ingenuity. We should look at how we measure the wealth of our planet. We should basically look at the numbers of people. We should look at how we make choices and make decisions. That is the only way forward if we look at all these various scenarios. Meaning that we change our value basis in a very significant manner. Not measured anymore by primarily the economic compact, but by all kinds of other scenarios. Also how your neighbor is doing. That you can actually accept that hunger should not be there. Those things are all part of those scenarios. And one particularly interesting way to think about this is not a good term to sort of keep in your mind, and there's actually, is that what we need is an intellectual and a socioeconomic change, which is sometimes called the Great Transition. Meaning that we cannot go on this trajectory as we can see the collision course in some way happening. Not for everybody. Frankly, we'll be okay. The US, climate change, all these other things. The biggest issue is abrupt change, but gradual changes, we could probably manage that, although there will be all kinds of financial issues and losses, of course, sad as they are. But we have to actually go deeper because there are going to be more people on this planet, more needs. And so this argument of the Great Transition, retuning our value system is key. What makes you happy is probably not the increase in your salary. Although, of course, you want an increase, that's because it's a measure of how much you're valued. Does it really matter that much? Isn't it more fun if you have a good feeling that day? If you go to work because you like your work. Does get more pay make your work more fun? Probably not. Maybe to some extent, but actually, because I'm like all of us, I mean, I also measure my life in some of these numbers. We got to find a way to move away from this scenario where we measure in very basic and simple manners. We also have to keep in mind in the Great Transition that we have to start to value things you take for granted. Here's an exercise. Everybody do this. Take a deep breath. Felt good? Who paid for that breath? No, who paid for that? Where does it come from? Hey, it's your right. It's oxygen. Well, it's a commodity. It's a resource, and you expect it to be there, but you don't pay for it. Now, if you finish your Coke or whatever, your pop, you're willing to pay for that. It's just water with colorant. But the air, we don't value what we use as humans because we have decided to value only certain things. If you would have to pay for every breath you take, you certainly would worry about atmospheric conditions. And this sounds cute, but think about this. You do this all the time. You accept some things around you, the world around you, must give you stuff. You own that, ecosystem services. What if you value that? That's all part of thinking about a different way of how maybe 10, 11 billion people have to live on our planet as we go together. So the last thing to do is actually sort of a way that I try to always tell people where we insert ourselves. So when I started much of this environmental stuff, there was always this big bumper sticker, think global, act local. You may know that. You've sorted that stuff all the time. And that sounds great. That's wonderful. You think global and then you act local, and what does that mean? Well, it turns out is an excuse for us to not do anything to a large extent, because all these things, global and local, does not mean you, it means all of us. It's the group, it's the dynamic of the group, it's the government, it's the organization we're part of. It turns out that the only way forward is to actually, first of all, regionalize every issue that is there. So understand that if you live in California, you have different issues than when you live in Michigan. If you live in Michigan, it's different when you live in Bombay. If you live in Bombay, it's different from Shanghai. That you start to understand that issues are not global. They are nearly always regional. Climate change is regional. There's not going to be the same climate change everywhere in the world. Sea level rise is going to be highly variable around the world. On average, it's a certain amount. It will be very different depending on where you are in the world. But the most important thing is, and I sort of myself always shortchange that, but I've come to see how it resonates, is that you got to think personally. It does make a difference what you decide to do. Your small step matters for a very simple reason. There is 7 billion of us, all right? So if 7 billion of us decide to do personally certain things, that's a change. Secondly, I teach with business guys, and they always kind of like that part of it, that scenario. You know, business is not a bad animal. They're making money. They're only in the business of making money. If so, your decision as an individual, that's what drives business decisions. If you wouldn't buy it, they wouldn't sell it. They're not doing it in any other scenario. So this think personal is the message that I start to emphasize more and more, that even a small change, you don't have to be radical. You don't immediately have to sort of live in the countryside and sort of scoop your own wood. And well, by the way, that's a fossil fuel, but it's a recyclable fossil fuel. It's a closed circle. So I can explain that another time, but that's different. Burning wood is not the same as burning coal. But you don't have to do that, but even a small change, 1 shower less, or buying not 7 shirts every 3 months, something like that. That's really where you can no longer walk away, because now you personally make a choice. And when I often do this with the students, it resonates the most, because they are still young, they still don't have much, and they start to see that their choices will make a difference in the long run. And the other great thing is, if you make a choice, the person next to you also makes a choice, because they are motivated by your choices.